Hello everyone, Dr. Acker back with you for lecture number 10, the final one of the series for NSCI 306. Today we're looking at the idea of showing significance. And I put this lecture last for a couple of reasons. One, because it's a good place to end. It's kind of an advanced rhetorical skill. You've heard me say many, many times this quarter, so what? And this is one way to answer that. Certainly in your major projects, and as you get to the conclusion of any given paper, you want to ask that question. Why is this important? What have we shown that is significant for addressing some problem or for clarifying some term, for understanding some event, whatever it is you're trying to write about? And that's what a lot of what you'll be doing for your final papers. You're going to be showing not just the significance of a topic for your own interests or your own career or your own major, but also how understanding the particular research topics, there's particular papers you read, how they work together, how they are potentially important to a body of knowledge, and how they clarify at least the potential for something new, some new contribution that you can make in the spirit of they say, I say, of you've seen what they have written about, you've understood their arguments, you've gone through and figured out all of the ridiculously technical jargon, and now you can say, all right, based on this, here's my I say, here's what I want to contribute. So it's a very practical skill for that project in particular, showing the significance throughout the paper. But it's also, I think, a good capstone as you finish your formal writing education. For most of you, this will be your last writing class, perhaps ever, because the more you can understand how you show significance, the better you understand expertise in a certain area. A large part of being an expert in something, it doesn't matter whether it's an intellectual field or a mechanical field or just something where you're really, really good at a particular hobby, the farther you get along that line, the better you understand what to notice and why it's important. And so I have a little bit of a visual aid. This is one of my chess books. It's called, well, Chess. And this is known as the brick in chess circles because it's pretty heavy. There are 5,334 problems. And it's a very simple layout. See, just a set of chess positions here. And the idea is that as you move through the book, and no, I have not finished the book yet, but as you move through, you start to notice different patterns. You start to see, I know when there's the king is in this part of the board and there's this kind of potential threat here, I know what to do next. Or I know that these two pieces could work together in this way. Or I know that if I can remove this particular piece defending this square, then I can have an attack. And some of the problems are really simple. They start with like 200 problems of just checkmate in one. But they train you to notice what is important and what is significant. Because in real games, you're going to have to know that. You're going to have to see, I recognize this maneuver, this pattern, and so that if I could just get it to look like this, I can apply what I learned here. And you're going to be doing the same thing with any skill that you gain. You're going to notice what is important, what is significant in that field, in that project, in that task. And you're going to decide, how do I improve that? What would be different if I changed this? How can I make this just a little bit better? So as you go through the article for today, Sana and colleagues' essay on laptop multitasking in classrooms, I would encourage you to match up some of these skills, some of the elements that I'll be going through in the lecture notes, to the moves that they make. And that may help you in clarifying certainly how that article works for your response paper, but also as you look forward to finishing out the quarter, I think it will help you structure your own summaries and your own, certainly the synthesis section for your project, which I looked at in the last lecture. So let me switch over to our notes and we'll get started. Here, PowerPoint. All right. Computer's been a little recalcitrant here. That's better. All right. I know this is not technically a cat meme, but it's an otter meme, so I thought it was close. This is my significant otter. Those of you who took stats should know what that joke is. Want to look at several ways in which you can show significance in your project. And I'm going to kind of envision this in terms of an ongoing paper. And we'll finish up, because this is the last lecture, by going back to that idea and showing the significance of what you've done this quarter. So I'll wrap up with some concluding remarks about the course. We're not quite to week 9 of our truncated quarter, but I think it is a good time to reflect on what you have accomplished and what you will be accomplishing over the next couple of weeks as you finish up paper 2, as a way not only to help you evaluate my performance in the course, but also to evaluate your own performance as we wrap up spring 2020 and hopefully move on to a much more sane summer and fall term. So as with a lot of writing practices, this starts in the planning stage. We've looked quite a bit this quarter at how rhetorical appeals work, how we can break certain things down. You practice that a lot in paper 1 in particular. And part of identifying what works for an audience is figuring out what is going to be important or significant to them. So the first piece of advice I would give here is don't confuse what you find interesting with what your audience will find significant. You may be the expert in the room. And I hope in a lot of research project contexts, you are that expert. You know way more than your readers do, even your professor, about that little corner of the universe. But it's not going to be enough is to say, hey, this is cool, and therefore you should listen to me. Because as we learned early on, if you just say the cafeteria's fish sticks are gross, you're not going to get anywhere because you don't have an argument yet. So one thing you can do is think about the timeliness. And go back to the model of Greek rhetoric here. This is kairos. I mentioned this before. Kairos is the idea of a balance, like a scale. And this is a way to measure what is important here and now about the content you present or the argument you make or the implications you have at this point in time. Remember, one of our elements in the thesis AutoCAD, the D is it makes a difference. You make a claim, I have an idea here, you make an argument, and you make a difference in what we do with that information. Kairos measures what difference does that make right now. So I work for one of my editing clients is a journal, an academic journal. And in most cases, journals publish stuff with about a 6-month to 1 year lead time. So because they have to get everything arranged and the layout right and copy it and send to the printer and all that stuff, you can't just, in most cases, send something into them and say, hey, this looks great, we're going to publish it, and it's out 2 weeks from then. So usually there's kind of a lag there. And so Kairos is a little bit tricky in a setting like that. In this particular journal, they've been sending me mostly materials for their next issue, which is going to be on physical education. But they also wanted to put together a kind of immediate issue on education and COVID-19, because that's going to be a lot more timely now than in 6 months when hopefully we'll have resolved a lot of the more urgent problems. And it's certainly going to come across differently now than it would 6 months ago. Realistically, if you had said, okay, so it's what, May, let's say in December, there were a few cases, there have been cases diagnosed of COVID-19 in China at least. Not a lot, if any, in the US yet. So if you had said, you know what, there's this really nasty virus going around in this part of China, and I think it's going to make a big difference in how we view education in the next year, then the journal editors would rightly say, no, next please. Obviously the world has changed a lot since then. And so now in terms of Kairos, it makes a lot more sense. And so sometimes finding something that is significant, it is about what is important right here and right now. This is why when you study a historical text or an artifact like a novel, you have to decide what is going on in that period, in that culture, maybe around that author's life, that is going to make this thing important. So one of my dissertation novels was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And, if you had to pick one theme in Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's slavery. Well, race and slavery, I suppose. Because Stowe was writing in the 1850s, when that was pretty much what everybody was talking and arguing and writing and thinking about. And because we were, 10 years away from literally a civil war on the topic. So it was a very timely appeal then, and often would reference not only kind of the generic, the broader questions, the broader moral and political questions about slavery, but it also referenced like the fugitive slave law, which was then very, very recent. It had just been passed in the past year or two. And so parts of that argument were timely. Now, if you read it today, you kind of have to put yourself in those readers' shoes and think, how would they respond to these kinds of scenes and these kinds of characters? Because that's going to be very different. We do, unfortunately, still have some forms of slavery today, but it's a very different world than it was in 1850. And so there's that little bit of a gap there. As I mentioned earlier, understanding what is significant and evaluating how and why is going to require different levels of expertise. So I am an okay chess player. I have a pretty decent grasp of tactics. I can at least last 10 or 15 moves against much better opponents. I don't generally beat them. And so when I look at the board, I can see certain possibilities and certain potentials. Whereas if an actual master player looked at my games, they would probably say, oh, how did you not? Oh, no, don't put the pawn there. Oh, go on to do better things with their time. And it's the same way with your readers. Depending on what they know, what they understand, and where they are experts, they're going to notice different things and they're going to assign different values to them. So part of your job as the writer, even as you're planning the study, is to explain how and why this is significant. We're going to look at several elements in the next few slides. I want you to think particularly, though, about how it's designed, so how it's set up, what sort of data is involved, and what sort of results you present. And I'll walk you through those elements next. Part of what you're doing in paper 2, in that literature review, is figuring out what has been done and where you could potentially contribute. Now, this is a very low stakes version of this practice. Most of you, maybe you'll get a chance to do that kind of research, but it'll probably be considerably later in your academic careers. But you may also be able to bring some of that knowledge to bear on a summer project or a senior thesis, or looking forward even to a graduate thesis, as I suggested earlier. And so as you are reviewing that work, you do have to mind the gap. You have to figure out where is that gap in previous scholarship. And it doesn't mean that the other scholars did a bad job. It means recognizing there's only so much they can cover. There's only so much data they can collect. There are only so many ways they can approach that. And so maybe there's something that you find significant that has been overlooked or understudied. Again, going back to Kairos, some elements of online education were mostly of interest to a relatively small group of students and professors and administrators, because it wasn't a big part of our everyday college experience. It is now. Every single faculty member, students, most of the administrators and a lot of the staff at Cal State will have to figure out, how does my life change now that I am doing everything online? What equipment might I need? What skills do I need to develop? And so you're going to see a lot more, and we have seen a lot more attention to areas that maybe we didn't think as much about before, maybe that we haven't really done work on. And that is how not just science, but every area of intellectual inquiry works. Every new generation, every new scholar thinks, you know what? We need to know more about this thing. And maybe it's driven by interest. Maybe it's driven by there's something important here, some application that I think could change the world. Maybe it's driven by, to be honest, grant funding. If you're working in a lab, you probably are going to work on something that's relevant to your advisors or your supervisors' work. That's kind of how it goes. But you find some way to contribute to that conversation. So as you figure out what that is, then you need to show specifically how and why that is significant. This is the kind of work you're doing in your synthesis section in paper 2. So it's not enough, in other words, just say, hey, no one has thought about how online education affects walruses in Tibet. I don't know if there are any walruses in Tibet. But if there are, okay, they're probably not affected much by online education, but you could make the case. Okay, maybe not. But you can find better examples, I'm sure. And so part of your job is to say, why does this matter? Why is it important that this area has been overlooked or understudied? And what exactly do you want to focus on? Are there particular characteristics? Are there certain variables? Is there a method you need to apply that's going to be helpful here? Is there a research setting that's going to make a difference? So if you have 100 studies on online education in public universities, and you think, well, those are helpful, but what happens if we change to a private school, like a small liberal arts college? Just down the street from me is University of Redlands. And I'm sure they're online for at least the spring. I'm not sure about the fall yet. But they're used to a much different kind of environment, much different kind of campus than Cal State. And so they're going to have to approach some of these tasks differently than they would in a place where, you know, we have at Cal State a huge advantage. We've got a dedicated, very, very skilled IT team, and they work 24/7, I think, on tools and on troubleshooting, on tech support, all this stuff for us. And I would guess has a slightly smaller budget for that. And so they're going to have to find different ways to approach this. Likewise, we're a university. What about a high school or a middle school or an elementary school? What happens if you have something in a rural area in the US? Or thinking globally, what's going to happen to schools that just where computers are really not an option at all? And that's actually been some of the discussion going on in some of the work I've been editing for the journal. So once you have that significance, you show, all right, this is why it's important to look at these things. And so you want to say, how do I contribute? And this should be in some way that is significant to the field, to some intellectual importance. Maybe there's not a lot of directly practical applications in the sense of we're going to make so much more money if we do things this way, or we're going to smooth out the process for this particular mechanism, or we're going to be more efficient or more sustainable, or whatever your goal is there. But it might be, you know what, we need to look at this kind of data differently. We need to rethink how we are doing this process. Again, go back to your audience. So how does your study meet some of their relevant needs? And the more you know about what that might look like for them, the better you can pitch your study and show that it is going to be a relevant product, so to speak, in this marketplace. And so that takes me to gathering the data. And this is another area that needs a lot of planning, but it's also kind of the least predictable part, because you never quite know what data you're going to get until you get it. We have in literary studies, a lot of my colleagues have done work in historical archives, and I've done some of that for my own dissertation as well. And there's lots of really interesting, cool stuff in the archives, but it's sometimes rooms full of old books and papers, and you never quite know what you're going to find until you kind of dive in there. And the same thing goes even more so for gathering any sort of primary data. If you're going to do interviews or do surveys, then you can design your study in such a way to gather data that's going to be of most use for the projects you have in mind. So here's one of the challenges. You need to fill that gap. So you need to gather the right data that's going to do that. That's going to show, here's now what we know about this outcome or this group or this setting or whatever variable you choose to change to make your contribution new. But you also need to connect that study to the they say, to the previous analysis. Maybe that means a model that's established. Maybe that means a survey instrument that other people have used. Maybe that just means a starting point because you don't want to reinvent the wheel every time you want to make an argument. As you're doing that, both planning and later analyzing your data, you want to think about what could potentially influence the outcome that you're interested in. So in the Santa article, they knew there had been a lot of work done on multitasking in general. And they knew that some of it had been done in an academic context, and some of it had also been done in terms of various uses of technology, including laptops in the classroom. But they still had to think, since they're doing kind of a controlled experiment, what is likely to make a difference in our data? Things like the placement. So think of the research study here. So they have some students actually using their laptops during class, during the simulated classes. It's an experiment. And I believe in some cases they had them actually like taking notes or doing stuff that's actually relevant to the class, because that totally happens a lot. Oh yeah, everybody's taking notes on their laptop and on their phones. And they had some doing the more traditional activities of whatever the heck they wanted to. And so they thought the content, what you're using the laptop for, could probably make a difference in how well multitasking works. So if you spend the whole time and you're actually taking notes, or maybe you're looking up words that you don't understand in lecture, or you're dragging over resources, whatever it is to help you process that information, maybe that will actually contribute more than if you're playing games or texting your friends or something. And that would make sense. But there may be other potential influences. And they may work individually, or they may combine, such that if you are playing games, but you're sitting in the back, maybe it's not a big problem. Hopefully your sound is muted. Anyway, turn off your phones in class. Sorry. Actually, you don't really have to turn off your phones in class anymore because no one's in class anymore. But certainly something like the placement of the laptop in the classroom. If you're sitting in front, a lot more people can see your laptop. Maybe even things like the screen size, the size of the device, or how loud you are in using the laptop, or whether you can see the screen from different angles, because there's some privacy screens you can put on, and it'll say you can only see it from straight on, which could be helpful. It may make a difference what the course content is, or whether the student is in a majors course where they're relatively familiar with the material, or a gen ed course where they may not be. Now, you can't test every single one of those. So you want to figure out what data is going to be most useful for isolating the important factors, significant factors, and showing how they affect the overall outcome there. Another balancing act, another potential challenge, is you need some sort of comparability. If you're going to generalize your findings to other research settings, maybe other classrooms in this case, other colleges or universities, you might need to duplicate some factors from other studies, some elements that will give you comparable and generalizable data. So if 5 or 6 other studies have already looked at college students, you have to ask, do I want to do another study of college students? Or would it make a difference to look at middle school students and go back to the whole thing of what's going to be important here and why is this significant and all of that? We talked about sample sizes. In Wakefield study, there were 12 children. In Milgram's study, at least the one we looked at, there were 40 participants. Now, we could probably argue that 40 is going to give you more reliable data than 12. But you could also say, well, what about those populations? What might make a difference in the findings and the reasonableness and the participants' willingness to shock and all this stuff? And that's why Milgram did a whole series of experiments. And so it's not just a matter of there's one perfect set of data that's going to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt your hypothesis. It's going to be a series of negotiations and a series of balances. What is going to work well to get this kind of data, and what's going to be practical and what we can actually gather and actually use in the study. And so ultimately, your job is to show that this is the best available option to answer your research question and to make a significant contribution. As you might guess, your research question is likely to change as you figure out what you want to look at, as you think about where can I get this data, how can I get this, whose permission, especially ethical board permission, do I need to do this, and what's going to be the best way to, for instance, get this thing published. Again, openings advice, don't mistake your interests for significance to your readers. If you can find some balance there, then you're a lot more likely to be successful in reaching those readers. So you got your data, and then comes the fun part. You have to analyze your data. When I've touched on some of these techniques and some of these models in an earlier lecture, so you may want to go back particularly to the summary and synthesis lecture, the last one, as well as the material on reading scholarship. To recap a little bit, you can contribute potentially with a new method. So maybe there's a lot of data already on your variable of interest, but you want to say, you know, the way this has been analyzed, the model that's used, or the way that's been measured is not really appropriate for the kind of work that I want to do. This is especially helpful if you have what's called secondary data, which just means somebody else has gathered it already. So several of you already for your research papers are looking at meta-analyses, studies of previous studies. So the group of, say, 15, 20, 30, sometimes even more studies that others have done. And the meta-analysis author said, okay, what trends are there? It's a great way to get familiar with the field. And so one way to contribute there might be to say, let's compare this particular variable across these studies. Or let's see what the advantages and disadvantages of these particular methods are. And so that could be a potential contribution, a potential way to show that your study is significant. I mentioned last time also quant and qual studies. Quantitative analysis is about numbers. And so you usually need to produce the numbers and then run multiple statistical tests to show what's different and what is a statistically significant difference. One of the first lessons I learned as an academic editor was to be very careful when I use the term significant, because a lot of my clients work with quantitative analyses, especially in STEM. And so if I said significant where they didn't actually mean it met this particular statistical threshold, that could actually throw off their entire argument. So I don't want to do that. I had to figure out some better ways to express that and expand my vocabulary a little bit. I'm not a stats professor. Maybe some of you have already taken stats, so you have a better sense of what could work for each of these. but I would advise seeing what kind of analytical methods and even individual tests that your colleagues use. What's in the journals? What is used in the papers? What is cited there? And what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of doing that? One of my clients is a sociology professor, and part of her expertise is in advanced quantitative analysis. And so she's always bringing in new models to do that, showing how can we better capture this particular trend in the data or this particular practice or this particular result. And that's worked well for her to show the significance of her work. So even if she's looking at a question that a lot of people have looked at before, she can say, I'm approaching this data in a new way, we're contributing some new data to this, and so this is a more appropriate way to do that. She can make her argument there. Qualitative data, as I mentioned last time, is more about experience, sometimes individual experience, but kind of gathering more details on how a particular event went, or maybe particular thoughts or feelings or emotions about that. And so I gave the example of the SOTIs. You have the numbers, the quantitative scales of rating the effectiveness of the professors, but you also have the short answer section. And often that's a lot more helpful for me than the numbers, because that's where I get things like, this assignment worked pretty well, but I was just completely lost here. Or what I usually get whenever I teach a morning class is, I like the class, but 8 a.m. or 7:30 a.m. or no, before 7:30, I'm just not going to teach. And so that's going to be different kinds of data. When you're analyzing that, you generally can define significance in more flexible ways, but you still have to show how those patterns work and why a particular pattern is important. So you might have a series of qualitative interviews, and you notice, a lot of my interviewees use this particular comparison between their sports team and a family. Well, why is that important? And so you might go back and think, what do they actually say here? How far do they push that metaphor? Why is this important to this result? Again, it's part of the persuasion. It's part of showing what's important about that work. In terms of the sample size specifically, generally the smaller it is, the more difficult it is to generalize to the larger population. You typically have to show a fairly consistent pattern in that, typically with a majority of your subjects. So in the Wakefield study, he argued that 8 out of 12 of the children exhibited what he called this new syndrome that had both gastrointestinal and neuropsychological effects, and that he argued was at least correlated with the MMR vaccine. And we talked about how that was just a slightly problematic conclusion. But if he had just said, I found 4 out of 12, or even 6 out of 12, maybe it wouldn't be such a big deal. Because he's making a pretty big claim that would make a very big disruption in health and certainly public health and kind of parenting practices. But he got impressive numbers on the face of it. And so that suggested maybe there is something to the generalizing effect that he said this is going to be true in a larger population. And that's probably one of the things that motivated more people to do those follow-up studies and to say, well, what actually has happened here? And eventually to debunk his original claims and that they don't actually hold up. In your results and in your discussion sections, here's another balancing act to show significance. You want to focus on the stuff that's most relevant to your novelty, to the new things that you contribute, which is kind of a duh. Obviously, if you're going to say, hey, the purpose of the whole study is to look at this new variable, this new setting, whatever it is, then you want to pull out the data that is most relevant there. But you also have to look at this in the context of your broader findings or your broader conclusions. And one reason for this is because there could be outliers in your data. An outlier breaks a pattern and it breaks it big so that the scale is a little bit off. This is why sometimes if professors curve grades, they might drop the highest and the lowest grade in the class and curve everybody else. Because if you got that one kid, sorry, who always got, the 99% or 100% on everything, and you're down here with like, hey, I squeezed out with an 87. I think that should be good for an A once he curves it. Well, maybe not. So the outlier data is going to mess with your patterns. And part of your job as an analyst is to decide, is this a significant part of the data? Is this really reflective of how this whole thing works? Is this an important part of that? Or is this just some weird case? And anytime you have to generalize or characterize a group of texts, or not even text, a group set of data, you're going to run into that problem. I remember I was putting together a little presentation several years back, and I wanted to plot the number of class absences in one of my composition classes against the course grades. And I had good records of all the attendance data and, of course, the grade data. Of course, I took out all the names, so none of that made it into any of the reports. And typically, there weren't a lot of students who missed more than about 6 or 8 classes. I mean, over the whole quarter, because, at that point you typically drop because that's a month of classes. But I had 1 or 2 students who just stopped coming and didn't drop the class. And so it had my chart the first time looked like, it's okay, 2, 3, 4, 5, 17. It's like way out here. You can't even see it. It's off the screen because it's that far up on the graph. And so I actually kept it there because it made an interesting talking point. But some people they just stop showing up. But realistically, that doesn't really help the case in my data. Because I could say the number of absences in the class ranged from 0 to 17. And everyone would be like, whoa, 17? Someone missed 17 times? And that's the outlier. It doesn't really make that big a difference in the overall analysis. Now, if like 6 people had missed 17 times, then we'd have a problem. And that would be something that's less of an outlier and more of a trend. As you're putting together your results section and your findings, results and findings are the same thing, results and your discussion section. And I realized that this is beyond paper 2, but thinking ahead, you do want to make that in conversation with the earlier work. And you'll see that in the Santa article. They never quite lose sight of what has been done and where their results might differ from other work. And that's going to be a big part of any discussion section that you read. You're going to highlight interesting data, usually something new, something significant, something unexpected, and they're going to try to explain it. So one of your jobs as a researcher is to account for those results. What contrasts with earlier work? And think of things like, how big is that contrast? Does this completely flip the percentages? Does this say, well, there's a 5% gap here, but a 10% gap there? Is this really within the margin of error? Likewise, maybe something doesn't match well with what you expected. Well, you got to account for that. And sometimes it requires speculating, well, what might have happened is this. This could be just because of this population that we surveyed. But ultimately, you want to show that this is a significant and useful way to look at this data. And so as best you can, you want to account for those differences. I talked in an earlier lecture about the naysayer. And this might be a good place to bring that sort of move in, because if you thought something completely different was going to happen, as for instance, Milgram did, then one option would be to say, okay, now you might be thinking, well, what about this? Why is this happening this way? And you could deal with those objections there. Or, didn't you deal with this the completely wrong way? Or, well, wait a minute, Stanley. Didn't you have some pretty negative effects on your participants? That was Bauman's argument, of course. And so that could be a way to respond to those in this section. And the last thing you want to think about in this practice is what happens after the study is done. I've said several times this quarter, your rhetorical attitude is sometimes as important as your rhetorical content. So if you show yourself to be someone who's willing to continue that conversation, to say, you know what, there's more to be done. Either I need to understand this better, we need more or different data, we need to test this, apply this. This is not the last word on the subject. They're going to come across a lot better. As you move into that part of your argument, certainly you want to highlight what you've done. So as you discuss what's going on, be explicit about what are the implications here, and how does this contribute? And oftentimes you'll see sections in an article titled or implications or contributions. That's good practice, especially if you have to say, hey, here are the 3 things that I've accomplished in this article. Some fields might have theoretical implications as well as practical or policy-based implications. So if you have measured certain educational data a certain way, this would be more probably in the quantitative analysis side, then you could say, well, now that we've done this, here's what we know about how this should work theoretically. Here's how we should update our assumptions or our frameworks doing this. But we've also found these specific things, and therefore we should approach this differently. In terms of the education in COVID-19, maybe you have found that students respond in a certain way to online classes differently than they do to face-to-face classes in some particular aspect. And so we need to update how we think about, how we analyze online education versus face-to-face education. But we also need to think, what are we going to do about this moving forward? Because there will be a time when we're back in our classrooms. There will be a time when we actually interact with one another and use the same desk that someone else used. And maybe we'll all be wearing masks and gloves or in plastic bubbles, but hopefully at some point we'll actually get back into physical interactions with each other. And so when that time comes, we're going to have to rethink how and when do we use online education. Perhaps there will be a time in the next, say, 5 years when college students especially will think, man, you know what, I'm really burnt out on Zoom classes, and I don't want to do that ever again. Maybe you were there 9 weeks ago. I feel you. But that is going to affect how do we decide which sections to put online? What sort of qualifications do we look for in instructors? What sort of expectations do we have of our students? What sort of infrastructure do we need maybe in a campus setting? Like how are we going to handle computer labs? Stuff like that. So there's going to be both theoretical and practical importance there. This is also a good place to acknowledge what is limited about your study. And to be honest, sometimes that's out of your control. Maybe you didn't quite get the data that you wanted because there just wasn't a way to collect that in a convenient or affordable or ethical way. Maybe you couldn't really test the causal relationships involved. For example, if you wanted to test in an education context, which is more effective, teaching in method A or method B, then you need at least 2 classrooms, one for each method, and you've got to figure out how do you make everything else equal, but you only change that. And then you've got to think, is one of these others a better education is one of the more helpful. Like, are we depriving our students in section B of the stuff that they should be getting from method A? And those are hard questions sometimes. So those might be limitations to talk about in a study. The best authors that I've read use that as an opportunity. So they say, all right, here's what we couldn't do in this study, but here's how future studies could build on that. And that might be as simple as we need to replicate this study in other contexts. We need to think about other variables that could be important here, as I was discussing earlier. You can even say, all right, now that we know that this method is helpful, we need to look into how do we use this information. And this is a very common move in medical research. So I edit a lot of papers on cancer treatments, and it will often, it's not yet to the point of, so we gave them this pill and then everyone got better. It's more the level of, here's how this particular set of genes might interact with each other, and here's how the presence of this protein or whatever it is more pronounced in patients with this prognosis. And therefore, if we look for this, and maybe if we tweak this gene or think about how do we use this in development of different medications decades down the line, this could help later. And so you have an opportunity to extend or enrich what's been done, what I'm encouraging you to do for the synthesis section of paper 2. Lastly, you want to go back to your 2 favorite questions, so what and now what? So remind your readers, why did you do this? What is important about your results? And what are the opportunities in future work? What can we do now that we couldn't before? What do we know now that we couldn't before? I hope that at the end of, well, hopefully each lecture, but certainly at the end of the quarter, you can do a lot more in your academic writing than you could before. That you know a lot more, that you understand how these different details work. And you want to do the same thing in your arguments. So we have a lot to think about in terms of significance. And I encourage you to approach it not just as something you show at the end or even also at the beginning of your paper, but something that you keep in mind in every aspect of what you're designing, how you're analyzing the data, how you're presenting it in conversation. It's a hard process. Something I've shared it here before, I'm sure. Rather than thinking about your papers just in terms of tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them, the 5-paragraph essay that you all learned in high school. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them why you told them. That's going to get you a lot better results. To wrap up then, to say some concluding remarks about the course as a whole. You guys already have access to your studies. I sent you an email about that the other day. And I do hope you will fill those out a little closer to the end of the quarter, but if you want to do that now, I'm going to give you some information about those and also kind of revisit what we've done and what you've accomplished this quarter. I think that's a good way to prepare yourself to give better feedback about the whole experience. So we started this course with principles for arguing like a grown-up, talked about acknowledging the complexity of the work that you do or the issue that you're writing about. We certainly see a lot of that in science writing because everything is complicated. I mean, maybe before you read Milgram's article, you thought, okay, what is so hard about getting people to obey? Well, turns out there's a lot. And I hope that's a reaction you get when you read any scholarly articles. That is way more complicated than I thought it was. Talking about focusing on ideas rather than feelings, not to discount or ignore feelings completely, but to use them in service of arguments, to think about how is emotion working here and how do you use that to maybe keep motivated. I hope that all of you are writing on research paper topics that you enjoy, that you have positive feelings about, that are going to be useful and helpful for you as you move forward. But I also hope that you're basing the argument itself not on, hey, I should do this because this is really cool, but on here's the specific reasons why this works. Part of that is using your evidence clearly and honestly. And we spent a lot of time looking at different kinds of evidence this quarter. Sometimes that's statistical data, numbers. Sometimes it's interviews. Sometimes it's lab results. Whatever your starting point for the data, wherever you get that evidence, you've got to present it well. You've got to clarify, what does it actually say? Don't be like Wakefield and fake your results. And you've got to be honest about where that gets you. You know, don't let the data speak for itself, but maybe let it have the loudest voice. Not sure how far I can push that metaphor. Our fourth principle was to take opposing viewpoints seriously. And that's one reason why I included the exchange between Baumrind and Milgram. And I saw a lot of good work in your response papers on that, because it wasn't exactly a one-sided debate. You know, Milgram certainly had some potential ethical issues in his study, but he also had certain defenses for those. And he argued without necessarily being unpleasant. He was able to disagree without being disagreeable, as the memes put it. Then lastly, our fifth principle was to respect everyone's right to free speech. It's a big, big universe out there. And you're going to run into people you disagree with. You're going to run into people who have radically different beliefs, sometimes potentially dangerous or harmful beliefs. But at least in the US, they have the right to share those. We also have the right to ignore them and to yell at them and to disagree with them, to tell them exactly why they're buttheads. But that's all part of the fun. We also set out several course goals. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these tasks, but I want to remind you of some of the work that you have done. We looked at rhetorical tools to improve your arguments, to figure out how to set those up, how to advance them. We looked at particular writing skills on a technical level. We practiced summarizing, analyzing, and responding to those texts. You looked at revision quite a bit. We looked at editing and proofreading. We looked at peer evaluations. You'll be doing another round of those in a couple of days. And of course, you looked at rewriting, because the goal of all this is to improve your own writing. We talked about different academic disciplines and genres. We talked about how they expect different things, how they are making arguments in different ways. One of my goals for paper 2 is to get you more familiar with how professional writing works in your field, because you'll be reading a lot of it, whether that's in the classroom or in your full-time career. And so we looked at different ways to write in different genres. Obviously, we couldn't cover everything in 9 weeks that you're going to be writing about in the rest of your careers. But I tried to focus on these skills that are going to be most helpful, and the techniques that are going to be practical for you as you move on to those different tasks. And as you're doing right now, I'll put together a rough draft in paper 2. You are reporting on meaningful research. In this exercise, it's mostly academic sources, but you've been looking at non-academic sources for paper 1, and you've been figuring out how to kind of wrap your head around those and how they work. And so I want you to take a minute then to remember what you have done. And yes, I know you're still working on some other projects, because we're not actually doing this lecture at the very end of the quarter as I would in the classroom, but we have gone through a lot of materials here. You've certainly made improvements to your academic research and writing skills. Some of you came into this class completely terrified of yet another writing class, because maybe your last one didn't go so well, maybe it's been a couple of years, or maybe writing is just something that makes you uncomfortable to try to do it. I get it. I don't share those experiences, but I had to take math classes, and oh boy, there are points where it's just, this is not my thing. I want it to be over, but I've got to keep pushing this. So you've gone through that. We have looked over the course of the past 10 weeks between the projects and the class readings at about 50 to 20 examples of science writing kind of broadly defined. Sometimes that was in science journalism in paper one. Sometimes it was in popular science kind of articles. We looked at Jared Diamond's article to start off with, but we also looked at more technical material in the Wakefield and the Milgram studies. And of course, you're reading those journal articles for paper two right now. We looked at stuff all the way from the 1960s to the present, looking at some of the standards changed and how some of the expectations changed among the readers. You thought and talked and wrote a lot about how science writing works rhetorically, not just in terms of the arguments, but of how can it reach certain audiences. And so we looked at, for instance, Ben Goldacre's writings in Bad Pharma, and some of the techniques he used there, some of the ways he addressed people that would be very different from here talking about it and doing a journal article. We look at some of the stuff that's kind of in between the specialist and generalist. Diamond's Easter's End, I think, would fall into that category. And we looked at the techniques they share, but also the ones that maybe are different for different audiences and different venues. What you're working on right now, you're reading and summarizing and synthesizing recent scholarship in your major or career field. And I think this is one of the most practical assignments you will do in your college career. Because especially those of you who are heading for a career in research, this is something that never stops. It's not like you get to do one round of term papers in college or even graduate school and say, okay, I'm done. It's a constant practice of getting familiar with trends in your area, of reading, of going to conferences, of being more of an expert in the things that you're an expert in. Because you're going to get left behind otherwise. Think of all of those computer programmers who learned COBOL and Pascal and maybe now even HTML. When I took computer programming, it was HTML, JavaScript, and this brand new thing called Perl. Those skills would not be particularly marketable in a Python marketplace, for example. And here's the big one. Over the course of these 9 weeks, you have planned, drafted, revised, and published about 10,000 words of college-level academic prose. That's 40 pages between your exercises, your homework, your response papers, your rough drafts, your final drafts, even, yes, those peer review papers, the little ones, everything adds up. Now, of course, it's a lot easier to spread that out over 9 weeks than it is to do it once. But I want you to think about this. Next time you run into an assignment and you think, oh no, 2,500 words, how am I ever going to write 2,500 words? Well, you've done it. And hopefully you'll do it much better now that you have that experience behind you. You know that you can do this work. Since our topic today is showing significance, I thought I would wrap up by telling you why I think writing well matters outside of college credit, outside of graduation. There is an outside of graduation, believe it or not. How is this skill going to help? Because let's be realistic. You guys are in this class because it fulfills a graduation requirement. But I hope what you found is that these are techniques and ideas and even just habits that are going to apply to other things, both in your college classrooms and in your careers. So why does this matter? Why are we here? Well, first of all, it's because writing is a relational process. Writing matters because people matter. And I found that the way you write to certain audiences, the way you think about them, the way you address them, often reflects what you think of them. Sometimes on a personal level, but also, why do you care about communicating this idea clearly? Why do you want to maintain respect or retain dignity or show something to your audience? I think that's going to be reflected in how you write. On a more Machiavellian level, writing well definitely gives you a competitive advantage. And I think the genres that show this the best are the resume and the cover letter, two of the things that I work on a lot as an editor. because, oh boy, it's probably not fair, but you will be judged by the quality of writing in your resume and your cover letter. Companies spend billions of dollars every year trying to improve their employees' writing, training them in professional communication, fixing their writing, updating everything, hiring editors and copy editors and proofreaders like me. And so this is a big investment for them. And every time business owners are surveyed, they're asked, what would you want to improve about the people you're hiring? Writing skills is at the top of the list, especially among recent college graduates, which is kind of sad. But it does mean that if you get yourself noticed for communicating well, for writing clearly, for doing your work, then you're going to have a significant advantage over the other people applying for that fellowship or that scholarship or that job or that internship. And that's going to be true throughout the course of your career. I mean, I'm an English professor and an editor, so I probably pay more attention to writing quality than most people, but I can tell you, it's something I notice a lot in the people I interact with. How well do they communicate with me in an email? What's the copy on their website look like? How do they present themselves? Because, you can have a good product and a few typos, but if you don't care enough to present you make a case for your service or your product well, I don't think I'm going to care enough to give you my money. Maybe that's just me, but I think it is a helpful skill in the marketplace. Writing also gives you access to a much more diverse audience. And I don't have to tell you guys this because, look around you in Southern California. We have people who you'd have to reach with different languages, different dialects, a whole range of different cultural beliefs and assumptions and thoughts and practices. And the better you can do that, the better you can succeed in connecting with them. Writing is a relational process again. But also more likely you can convince them to do what you want, especially to buy your product or to hire you for something. One of the skills that I found most helpful as an editor is being able to communicate complicated technical material to non-specialist audiences. I do a lot of projects that require that, something like grant proposals, because many of my clients learned how to talk to one audience in one way about their project. And they can talk in very intelligent ways, but you put them in a room with non-specialists, like, look, I have a dissertation. And they need someone to help them with that process. Fourth, writing well is a good way to demonstrate your expertise. And, obviously we're in a college classroom. It helps there, but you guys have expertise in a lot of different areas that maybe never actually show up in a college paper. And so I would actually point you toward, of all places, Reddit. Reddit is a scary, evil little corner of the internet for a lot of reasons, but it is a place where experts gather to talk about lots of different little things that they are good at. And sometimes they can be very, very practical. If you are looking for, how do I fix this stupid error on my printer, you're probably going to Google it, and you'll run into, if not Reddit, then forums like that, where people say, oh yeah, so you can change this setting in this one, and you can fix this here, or, well, the underlying problem is this, so what if you tried this here? Just browsing through some of the material there is a good way to get educated on how to do that. And as with anything, you'll come to appreciate people who can communicate that expertise clearly and consistently, whatever the venue is. On an organizational level, writing is vital to keep things running, at all. I have, I run my own business, and I've been a part of various organizations, universities, companies. I have worked with nonprofits, and sometimes the writing works really well and the organization runs very smoothly, and sometimes it doesn't at all. I worked with the American Checker Federation for several years, and for a couple of years of those, I was on the executive committee. I was at the highest level, and it was just a wreck in terms of communicating with paying members, in terms of doing things like marketing the organization, promoting events. And a lot of it was because they refused to do anything outside of closed door conversations with the same group of 5 or 6 people who had run the organization for 30 years. And it lost a lot of members. We started out in, say, 2000 or so with probably close to 1,000 active members. We're below 100 now in 20 years. And I did what I could when I was there, but I realized very quickly that unless they're going to do that regularly, then it's not going to help. Now, on the other side, I have been in organizations that communicate very well with each other, including by writing. The Cal State English Department is very good at that. Our chair, Dr. Carlson, writes great emails, and he's always keeping us up to speed with what's actually going on, what do we need to care about, what are some of the instructions and some of the complications going on. And especially now when we can't actually meet in person, and Zoom even is a bit of a stretch, that helps a lot. So be that one person who can help your organization run smoothly. Finally, writing contributes, I think, to better communication overall. And you're definitely going to run into people, you may be one of these people yourself, who does not really gravitate naturally towards communicating in writing. You'd rather make that phone call, or maybe you'd rather send that text rather than the email, or you'd rather sit down with that person face to face and say, okay, this is what's going on, and let's figure out a way to solve this problem. I'm biased. I like writing. But I found that the more I learn about writing in terms of organizing my thoughts and communicating them, the better I can communicate in other formats. I am not a natural public speaker, but I've got to lecture. I've got to talk to you guys in office hours. I've got to hold meetings. I've got to communicate with other people verbally. And I think that the more you can learn about how one kind of communication works, the better you can understand how people use other forms to communicate, even if it's not your native language, so to speak. And there's also, this will help in figuring out the relationships involved. Writing is relational, so is a lot of other forms of communication. My wife likes to communicate in person. She will talk to me. She tends to, even when we were dating, she would call me if she had some issue or question, and we would talk it out for hours. And the introvert in me would be thinking after about 20 minutes, okay, we've established all the facts. Let's just figure this thing out and move on to something else. But she would need to kind of process it. That's how she works. I process stuff by writing. And yes, I'm a big giant nerd. When I finally got it through my thick head that I wanted to be with her for the rest of my life, I didn't call her. I didn't go and see her, partly because I lived in Ohio and she lived in South Carolina. I sat down and I drafted a 1,000-word email, and I revised it, and I nitpicked, and I got feedback from another friend, and it's like, this has to be perfect, because this is going to be the most important email of my life. And so we came at some very different forms of communication, but we are learning that we can communicate with each other, maybe if we have some sort of hybrid. So I know that it's important to her to talk things through. And so I make a point to do that. she knows that I'm much better at remembering things if they're written down. Or so she will send me text messages or write down shopping lists for me because I'm probably not going to remember them. It's ongoing, but I think we're both learning to communicate better through that process. All right, well, that is all I have for you for the quarter. I want to close by saying thank you. You guys have been great. This is a very challenging quarter, to say the least. As you move on to your SOTIs, they are 100% anonymous. When I get the reports, which is not for at least 3 months, probably after the quarter ends, no names are on them. Please don't write your name anywhere on the SOTIs. But please do be honest and specific in your feedback, because this is what I use to improve my teaching. So if something didn't work, or if you thought that I could do something better, please mention that. I've gotten all sorts of feedback on these SOTIs over the years. Everything from totally the best teacher ever to one time you ate Cheetos in class. It was really rude and unprofessional. Well, I don't have any Cheetos with me, at least not on the Zoom screen. I got my bottle of water. But I was really annoyed when that came out, but now it's really just kind of funny. So please be honest as you go through those. You guys have done a great job in some very trying circumstances. Thanks for showing up to class. We had our live Zoom sessions. We had very good attendance throughout the quarter. We're asking those good questions, whether that was in the chat or by email or during office hours, putting in all the work, and you really produced some really good work. So I am proud of you guys. You should be proud of the work that you've done, and I'm confident that we will continue that pattern as we finish out our last couple of weeks. If you would like to stay in touch, I do that with my clients and with my students on LinkedIn rather than other social media, just because I want to have at least this tiny little wall between those two worlds. So there's my LinkedIn address. Feel free to add me there. It's also a very good way to keep in touch if you need a recommendation letter down the line. I'm glad to write those for you. So you can do that. My editing site is accurateedit.com. I don't work on anything that's for a grade, but if you are applying for a graduate program, you have a personal statement, or thinking forward a few years, if you do have academic, if you are working on journal articles or dissertations or something, I do a lot of those, or I can refer you to someone who does. Feel free to get in touch there. That's all for today. I will see you guys at the individual conferences for paper 2 in a couple of weeks. But other than that, signing out. Thanks for your attention this quarter, and hope you have a great finals week.